You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I have the great privilege of talking with Dr. Peter Gurry, and this is our first time meeting, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Dr. Gurry is the Associate Professor of New Testament and co-director of the Text and Canon Institute, I should say Associate Professor of New Testament, Phoenix Seminary, but that's also where the Text and Canon Institute sort of housed, right? Like that's the home?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So we had your colleague, Dr. John Mead, on not too long ago, and he talked to us a bit about the Text and Canon Institute, and so that was a fun conversation. And you guys did you just have a big conference?
We did. We had an academic conference over in Oxford on the question of textual groupings in New Testament manuscripts, what we call text types. So if anybody listening has been to seminary and had a course or a class on textual criticism, they almost certainly learned about these groupings of manuscripts, usually known as the Alexandrian, the Western, and the Byzantine text types. And so those have been much debated in the last few years, so we want to do a conference on that and bring together people to discuss the future or non-future of those categories.
You guys seem to be making some new inroads from what I'm gathering of what I've read of yours with regard to like text types and a genealogical approach. Yeah.
So my own dissertation was on what's called the coherence-based genealogical method, which is a mouthful.
Yeah.
But it's a computer-assisted method that tries to relate manuscripts and their text really using their relationship of their individual variants, and then use those to help the editors make decisions where their decisions are difficult. And it's important partly because it's, a novel method and has promise, I think, but also probably most people care about it because it's being used to edit the standard Greek New Testament, the Nestle Aulon Novum Testamentum Graeca, and then also the UBS Greek New Testament. That's what most people use in seminaries, Bible colleges, and
Right.
translators use them. So they're using that to edit those editions. So it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah. So what have you noticed with regard to that sort of editing? Like, what are there any big changes that have been made? Like, what's something noticeable,
Sure.
or something
So
like that?
they've edited. When I wrote my dissertation, they had only used it on the Catholic letters so far. So that's James through the book of Jude. It does not include Hebrews. And since I graduated and finished my research, they've now done Acts and Mark, and then Revelation just came out like weeks ago. So I haven't even seen Revelation yet. But yes, in each of those cases, the use of this tool, the CBGM, has led them to make changes in the text. Many of them are minor, things like adding a chi where there wasn't a chi before, or something like that, or an article, a Greek article where there wasn't one before. So there's plenty of pretty minor ones. Then there are some more significant ones. So going to the Catholic letters, which I'm most familiar with because that's what I did my research on. In the book of Jude, in verse 5, the Nestle Aulon 27th edition said that it was the Lord who led a people out from the land of Egypt. And the Nestle Aulon 28 says that it was Jesus, who led a people out from the land of Egypt.
Oh, wow.
And then in 2 Peter 3:10 is probably the even more prominent change, where the Nestle Aulon 28 now says that the earth and all her works will not be found, whereas before there was no word "not" there. So there's now a negative. There's an "u" there, an "uk," there before. So those are the two that come immediately to mind. There are others in the book of Acts and Mark as well. And Mark 1:1, for example, they've dropped I think there are brackets. Is that right? Hold on, let me check. Now I'm blanking. But I think in Mark 1:1, there were brackets around the phrase "Son of Man." Yeah, Son of God. The Nestle Aulon 27 has brackets around that. That, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ is Son of God. Brackets around Son of God. No brackets in the Nestle Aulon, in the next edition of the Nestle Aulon, which will be coming out.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Who knows? Next year or two. So there are changes like that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, you can like sort of see the trickle down effect from that sort of thing, right? So if it's
Yes.
changing in the Greek New Testament, eventually it'll start changing in commentaries,
Yep.
which will then change in sermons,
Mm-hmm.
which changes how people hear it,
Yep.
and receive it. Perhaps it'll start also changing English translation, like standard English
Yep.
translations as well. So that's a pretty big deal to say Jesus led them out of Egypt,
Right.
or the adding the word "not" when there was
Yeah.
no not there
Right.
before. The Mark 1:1 one. I mean, you can still infer from the rest of Mark that Jesus is the Son of God. So that
Sure.
one's been sort of debated for a long time
A
too.
lot.
But
Yeah.
those are, yeah, those are some pretty dramatic things. So I read that you're a pastor as well. Is that still the
Yeah.
case?
It's true. I'm
Yeah.
an elder at my church. Yeah.
So, do you get to talk about this sort of stuff with your folks at all?
It's funny. I don't think I've ever had anybody in my church come up to me on a Sunday and say, "Pastor, I just got a question about Mark 1:1 and which reading is original." Most people have to be reading their Bibles pretty closely to have those kind of questions. But I will say, yes, I've had opportunity to teach on it at my church, so people are aware that I work on this. And then we preached the Gospel of Mark just last year, and so probably will not surprise you that I was the guy that got tapped to preach on the ending of Mark.
Yeah.
So yes, there are occasions where I get to help people think through it at a pastoral level, not just an academic level. So yeah, it does
You
happen.
have those things in a standard Bible though, like brackets or a
Yep.
footnote, like this isn't found in our earliest manuscripts, and people tend to, see that kind of thing, and sometimes they'll freak out, like, what
Mm-hmm.
is this not
Yeah.
trustworthy,
Yep.
that sort of thing. So yeah, I imagine you're a good guy to have around at the church. I'm
So.
curious. So what is your perspective on the hotly debated ending of Mark?
It's a good question. So, my own view is that what's what we call the longer ending is not original to the rest of Mark's gospel. That I think it's most likely to have been added later. There's a couple reasons for that. One is obviously its absence in our two earliest complete copies of Mark. It's absent in a number of early translations as well. We have record of people like Eusebius talking about it missing in some manuscripts, that sort of thing. I should say that it's in the vast majority of Greek manuscripts. That's important to say. It's also important to say that our earliest evidence, one way or the other, comes from someone like Irenaeus, who explicitly quotes from the longer ending of Mark and doesn't even mention any issue. So I think if it was added, as I think it probably was, it was added pretty early on. The other reason I think it's probably added later is because it doesn't really fit very well. There's a very odd disjunction between the verses right in front of it and then the ending itself. What it certainly looks like when you read is it looks like a combination of material from other Gospels and Acts.
Right.
So it looks like you get a very brief description of the two guys on the road to Emmaus in Luke's Gospel, for example. And so I suspect that somebody, I don't know where it came from originally. It may well have been just kind of a short way to summarize the resurrection appearances. And then somebody thought, hey, well, let's just put this on the ending of Mark because Mark seems to be missing an ending. It's really hard to, we can only speculate as to how it might have gotten attached to Mark. Whenever it did get attached, though, it seems to have been very successful. And it's, because it got copied by most Greek manuscripts, pretty much all of them from that point on. So anyway, so my basic view is that to cut to the chase, my basic view is that it probably was added early on, but it was added. Then you have the additional question as a Christian as to what you do with it. Should you read
Right.
it as scripture still? I always tell people, like, the fact that it's not written by Mark is not a guarantee that it's not scriptural, not canonical, because obviously Mark also didn't write Matthew or Luke or John.
Right. Right.
And there are plenty of books in the Bible where we could say we're not quite sure who wrote this, but we still accept them as canonical. So even not knowing who wrote it is not in itself, I don't think, a guarantee. But my own view, and this has changed over time, I used to hold the position that though it wasn't original, we should still treat it as canonical, given how many manuscripts it is founded and how long people have read it as part of the Bible. I've kind of changed my view on that. Today I would say I think the best thing to do with it is to treat it to treat it, put it in the category that a lot of Protestants don't have anymore, but that they used to, and that's a category they used to have for what we call the apocryphal books, and that is these are things that are useful for illustrating Christian doctrine, but should not be used to establish Christian doctrine. So that's a bit of a distinction that is lost today, but I think it's an important one, a really useful one. And I found that a helpful way to think about it. And the great thing about the longer ending of Mark is there's nothing in it that's actually problematic theologically. So I'm always happy to say to people, if, say, you're a pastor and you've preached that text as Scripture, or you've been in a church where it's been preached as Scripture, you haven't been harmed by that, I don't think, in some great way. Because if your pastor is preaching it all faithfully, there's nothing in the longer ending of Mark that is theologically problematic. Now, people will usually ask about the snakes.
Yeah.
Of course. Okay. And I just always like to remind people that outside of a very small strip of the United States in, the modern era, the last 100 years or so, nobody has ever read the longer ending of Mark and thought, hey, let's bring some snakes in to our Sunday night service and just see what happens if anybody gets, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
in other words, that's a problem of interpretation and application. It's not a textual problem. So I don't think that actual verse about them handling snakes is a problem at all. We have verses in Luke that have no textual uncertainty where Jesus talks about his followers being, surviving scorpion attacks. And we have the account of Paul in the book of Acts being bitten by a poisonous snake and surviving. So I think actually what you find in the longer ending of Mark fits right in with those promises that Jesus gave to the apostles, that they would miraculously survive things that other people wouldn't because of their important role as apostles in founding the church. So my argument would be there's nothing in the longer ending of Mark that's problematic at all. Everything in there is perfectly fine theologically, but I personally would not use it to establish Christian doctrine, even though I'd be
That's
happy to use it to
interesting.
illustrate it.
I was reading a theological book. I think it was called Comparative Theology by Pope H. Shenouda. He was one of the popes of the Coptic Orthodox Church. I was just reading
Okay.
this a couple days ago, and he so the Coptic Church appeals to the longer ending Coptic Orthodox Church, the longer ending of Mark, as though it is
Scripture.
scripture, and
Yeah.
certainly treats it that way, and it forms, it seems at least from how far I've gotten the book, to form doctrine based on Mark 16 without any hesitation.
Yeah.
Which as
Sure.
a Mark and scholar, I've been preaching through Mark. I'm
Oh,
a
okay.
pastor as
Yeah.
well. I've
Yeah.
been preaching through Mark now for 3 years.
Okay.
That's a
Where are you at?
long time.
That is a
I
long time.
just this week I'm starting chapter 14.
Okay, so you're
Yeah,
getting close.
yeah, getting close.
You'll
Although
have to deal with it.
14 and 15 are long chapters.
Yeah. They're good
um,
ones, though.
yeah, the really good ones. 16, of course, if you don't take that longer ending, is short
It's a
chapter.
bit shorter.
Yeah.
It's a bit shorter.
So I just thought it was interesting to see there was no argument in the
Yeah,
formulation of
just
the,
assumed.
just
Yeah,
assumed,
and I think,
uh,
most Protestants have treated it that way historically.
hmm,
You can find discussions of it in the Reformation period, not a lot, but I think until, say, the late 19th century, it was pretty typical. It was in English Bibles in the King James Version, right? So people didn't have any reason to doubt it. There were no notes about it in the King James, right? So anybody who's just using English Bible has no reason, unless they're well studied or something, to think there's a problem. So, and that's why I say most people, I think, in church history reading Mark's gospel have read it with that longer ending, and that's
hmm,
what, at least before I kind of changed my mind, but still today it gives me some hesitation to say, I think you could make a good case, and again, it's one I used to hold, that hey, because of its long use in the church, we
right,
should accept it as scripture. And I know people who hold that view, and again, I used to hold it, so I'm not real dogmatic on
yeah,
this, partly because I think either way you're going to be fine. Now, where it does bother people is to think that how could something have been in the Bible this long that doesn't belong there?
right,
And that's where people have a hard time with it. And I am sensitive to that concern. But at the end of the day, I think we have to go with the manuscript evidence. And I think the best explanation for that evidence, for all of the evidence, is that it was probably added early on. And
Hmm.
then I have to fall back and think, I think I have to accept the version of Mark that was promulgated by the apostles and by their close associates. I'm just not comfortable saying because it's been used for a long time in the church, therefore it's inspired. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
think there are other individual verses, for example, that have been used by the church, and there are, say, verses or readings that have been used in the Vulgate for a long, long time, but I don't think belong in the Bible. So church use by itself is not enough for me.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's an important question, though.
Yeah, that sort of historical precedent, I think, is a good talking point. So you're thinking about all this kind of stuff in your teaching, but also with the Text and Canon Institute.
Yeah,
So Dr. Mead talked to us a little bit about the Text and Canon Institute, but why don't you share with us as well in case someone missed that episode or
sure.
yeah.
Sure. So basically, the Texan Can Institute is a um, like a center that Dr. Mead and I started here at Phoenix Seminary with the mission of, well, our basic tagline is illuminating the history of the Bible, and we basically what we do is we study the history of the Bible and then try to teach people about it, especially Christians, but also anyone who's interested in the history of the Bible. And so we do things like this academic conference that we just held in Oxford, but we also do stuff to reach lay people. So if folks go to our website at textandcanon.org, Canon has one N in the middle, by the way. If they go there, they'll see that we've got about almost 70 articles on our website on everything from questions of canon, so why do we have these books and not other books in our Bible, to textual problems like the long running of Mark. We've got 2 articles on the long running of Mark, one for and one against. And then things involving translation as well. So questions of English Bible translation, the history of it. So people like Tyndale, and if you think about the Luther Bible in German, that's an important stage in the history of the Bible. So we try to cover the whole gamut of how we got the Bible, and some of that is to help people who have doubts, to help them understand the context and hopefully alleviate those doubts. Some of it, though, is just to inspire people. One thing that John and I have found over the years in studying this is that we have come away from our own academic study of the history of the Bible really inspired by it. It's really amazing when you realize how many people have given so much time, energy, and sometimes their blood so that you and I can read the Bible pretty easily in English, and that we can only have arguments about which translation is the best because the Bible has been given so much attention by so many people that have gone before us. And so I think it's inspiring to learn and appreciate just how much people have done so that we can have a Bible that's pretty accessible.
Yeah, I think generally, like the wider Christian populace has very little clue about how the Bible came together, how we got the Bible, how we ended up with the English translations that we're working with.
Yep.
So it seems like a really good thing that you guys are doing there. What sort of response? I'm especially curious from just like laity.
Yeah.
What sort of response have y'all received?
Yeah, it's been really, really positive. We do one of the things that we do is we do a traveling conference on how we got the Bible for people called Scribes and Scripture, same title as the book we wrote. And we just, in 4 talks, we just kind of lay out the history. We talk about canon, we talk about text, and we talk about translation. And I think what we find is people who really like the Bible, and read it, and like you said, often don't know that much about where we got it. They're kind of surprised to discover how much they didn't know. They're kind
Right.
of like, well, I guess it did have to come from somewhere, but they'd never really thought about it. And once they do start thinking about it and start learning about it, they're really fascinated by it. So it's a really fun subject to get to talk about because for that reason, it's really fun to just kind of be the person that gets to introduce it to people
Right.
and see the light bulbs come on and the excitement and the kind of the wow and I had no idea. Like, most people have never thought about the fact that they have verses in their Bible, verse numbers, and like somebody had to make those. So
Right.
where do they come from, and why are they there, and is there a logic behind them? And the reality is actually a little bit different for the Old Testament than it is for the New Testament because different people are responsible for them there. And then thinking about like how does that affect the way you read the Bible? I always joke with people that before what, 1551, when verses were invented for the New Testament, nobody could go to a football game and hold up a John 3:16 sign. So how do you share the gospel at football games? It was impossible, So, but it's just fun to think about the ways that the Bible's history have been influenced by history and have influenced history. And I think that's a lot of fun to think about.
That's a really fascinating point. I mean, so prior to 1551, no verse numbers, but now, like, what, in just several hundred years, I mean, um, y- it's hard to like overstate how big a deal scripture
Yeah,
verses are
yeah,
in our culture, in the world.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you have, right, athletes writing them under their eyes,
Right.
football
That's it.
players,
That's it.
like,
Yeah,
they're everywhere.
they're everywhere.
T-shirts and signs and
Yep,
bumper stickers.
yep, yep.
It's amazing that in just several hundred years, right, how big of an influence scripture verses have
Mm-hmm.
become.
Yep,
Um,
yep.
so yeah, that's kind of fun, like, and then so I kind of look at, and forgive me if this is sort of a misnomer, but I kind of look at what you guys are doing almost as the opposite of what someone like Bart Ehrman is doing. Um, and
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
had Dr. Mike Lacona on the podcast not too long ago, and in his new book, he's talking about how he makes the claim that Ehrman is responsible for leading more people astray in this century than probably anyone. And
yeah,
I mean, he kind of like attaches some numbers to that too, I think. But um, yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, because when I look at what he's doing, that his whole enterprise seems to be built around casting suspicion on the text,
for sure.
whereas what y'all are doing seems to be like saying, no, we can trust this, like we
Yeah,
don't need to be suspicious, so we need to be curious about it, but not
yeah,
suspicious,
yeah.
but like that sort of thing.
Well, there's a couple things to say about that. I think it is interesting. Everywhere I go, I get asked about Bart Ehrman, and
Get
even when I
tired of it.
travel. Well, no, that's okay. But even when I travel overseas, like I'll talk to missionaries, and they will tell me that like people in foreign countries will know the name Bart Ehrman. So it's
Mm,
really his reach is really quite remarkable, I have to say. And I think what Bart, I mean, he deserves a lot of credit for just what a good communicator he is.
it's a
For one
great
thing,
communicator,
he's a great
yeah.
communicator, and also I think part of what explains his success and his widespread reach is there are a lot of people today who are looking for a reason not to believe the Bible. If that makes sense. So I think a
Yeah,
lot of what Bart does is he reassures them that it's okay for them to not take the Bible too seriously.
right,
So he's an
right,
apologist. He's just an apologist in the other direction.
right.
Um, what we're trying to do at the Texan Canon Institute is certainly reassure people that we think there are good reasons to trust the Bible. At the same time, we do want to do it in a way that takes the historical evidence seriously. I mean,
Yeah,
one of the great things about studying the history of the Bible is the Bible is a physical object. And so much of the evidence we have for it is in physical form, right? And so we can, you can look at a manuscript and say that is a copy of the
right.
Bible, and we think it's probably dated to this century, and like, you know what I mean? Like it's
Yep,
there. You can, you can dispute maybe the date of it, but you can't deny that it exists and it's there. So all that just to say, like a lot of the evidence we get to work with is very concrete, which I think is just helpful to people because a lot of people kind of, even non-believers, have this idea that the Bible just sort of came from nowhere, or that it came from it's sourced in such conspiracy that nobody really knows where it came from, right? And when you can
right,
just so open up and be like, look, here's like a second century papyrus of the New Testament, like, and it says Jesus is God. Like, what do you, this is before the
right.
Council of Nicaea. This is before the Council of Chalcedon. Like, there's no conspiracy here. Like, nobody doubts that John's gospel in its original form claims that Jesus is divine. You know,
Right.
and that for some people, honestly, even for people who are non-Christians, can be really helpful because in their mind, because the Bible is the book of Christianity, and Christianity is a religion, and religion is that kind of thing that's in its like special non-scientific category, and then you can kind of show them like physical artifacts, and it kind of like I've had people where I talk to them about this stuff, and you can almost see like something coming off of their eyes where they're like, wait a minute, you're telling me this is like a
Right.
real thing that like has history attached to it? It's not just like a God told me so in my bathroom one morning and I have to believe, it's like, no, like there's real concrete evidence for it. So, one of the things we say in our book, Scribes and Scripture, is, yeah, there are people who disagree with us on our conclusions about the trustworthiness of the Bible. For sure, Bart Ehrman would be one of them. But our differences are very much in terms of how we interpret the concrete evidence that's there.
Right. Right.
So much of the evidence is really concrete. Like the differences of the manuscripts are there, whether you like them or not, whether you want them to be there or not. Now we just have to decide, how do we explain them? And yeah, we have legitimate disagreements and differences about that. But part of what we're trying to say in the book is, I think as Christians, we can actually account for a lot of the historical evidence and still come away with a very high view of Scripture's authority.
And when I have engaged Ehrman's works, he talks about these, thousands upon thousands of scribal errors. And a lot of that, right, is really not an error, it's just a spelling variation.
Right.
And if you this is why, like, over my scholarly career, I've been so emphatic about using a first century, at least approximated first century pronunciation when we're dealing with Greek, right? So I don't use Erasmian or modern, which creates just as many problems as Erasmian. So we use what we call the Koine era pronunciation over here at Glossa House. But if you have this schema of pronunciation, and you understand that an omega and an omicron, right, they both sound O, and that when it's read out loud, it sounds the same exact to the listener. You realize, oh, that's not an error, right? It's just an orthographical interchange. It's not, and that immediately dispels thousands of his so-called errors, right? Like in one fell swoop. And so is that those sort of things, like, it sounds really good to say there are thousands and thousands of errors, maybe hundreds of thousands of errors, but when you understand something like that, then immediately it knocks the legs out from under so much of that kind of claim.
The other problem is, when text critics like me and Bart Ehrman talk about errors, that has a particular technical meaning in our discipline. It just means a mistake, like a difference between manuscripts.
Right.
When most lay Christians hear the word error, their mind often jumps to theological error or even historical error. And that's usually not what we mean, So you have to look long and hard to find differences in the manuscript where you go, they really rise to the level of like they would impinge on and create a theological error.
Right.
So Mark 1:1, I think, is a great example. Whether Mark calls him the Son of God in the first verse is important for how you read Mark's gospel, and especially the introduction there. But it's not like well, if Mark didn't write Son of God there, then Mark doesn't think he's the Son of God. Like,
right. Right.
Like the whole, it's a major theme in the whole book that Jesus is the Son of God, and it's really striking when you watch who recognizes Jesus as the Son of God, right?
Right.
And then of course there's a climactic moment at the cross where the centurion says this. So like, it's absurd to think that variant determines Mark's theology, let alone Christian theology. Right?
Yes.
So it's important to keep these things in perspective. It's not to say that the difference there has no effect on anything. It certainly has some effect on how you read the intro to Mark's gospel. I like to say it's kind of like, it's a question, does Mark want you to figure out who done it as you go, or does he want you to know right up front and then have the fun of figuring out how everybody, like you can do that with movies, right? You could start with the crime and you know exactly who did it, but then the whole rest of the movie is, how does he get away with it?
Right.
That's an interesting story. But you could also do it a different way, where you have no idea who's done it the whole time until the very end. And two ways to tell the same story. And I would say, this variant doesn't quite rise to that level, but it's a little bit of that. Does Mark want you to have it right up front at the beginning, or does he want you to see it as you go and have to kind of piece it together? So my own views, I think he tells you right up front. But
do you teach text criticism courses at Phoenix Seminary?
Yeah, I teach. So in my exegesis course, I get to do 2 weeks on it as all. But I do
Mm.
teach a THM level course that's just text criticism. That's all we do, and it's in depth, a deep dive. So yeah,
I think that's pretty rare.
yeah, it is.
Just like the biblical languages seem to be falling out of seminary and Bible college curriculums. Boy, I think it's super rare to
Yeah,
find a Bible college or seminary that's teaching an actual textual criticism course.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's the kind of subject that people tend to think is very dry and boring. And I kind of think about it the way I think of, like, when I meet a person at church who thinks theology is like, oh no, it's almost always because they've been taught poorly, right?
right.
And I think the same thing with text criticism. One of the things I love about teaching it is that students almost always come to the end and go, wow, I had no idea it was that interesting, and that there was that
Mm.
much to it. Because it's not just like, it's funny, I sometimes joke with the students, we actually don't spend that much time in the class solving individual, variance problems, because that's not really the point of the class. The point is to teach them how to do it, to give them
Mm.
the tools to be able to do it on their own. But we spend a lot of time thinking about how are manuscripts constructed and what do we learn about them
Right.
from that. What's in these manuscripts? I mean, one of the most fun things we do is we just read a different manuscript every week in class, and I just try to pick ones that have interesting things in them. And over the course of the semester, they discover every manuscript has interesting things in it. You
Right.
just have to look for them. So, to me, it's I love doing it because it's the same sort of thing like I mentioned with the churches. It's really fun to introduce people to something they think is going to be boring and dry, but that's actually not. So that's
I
just
was
teacher
I
is fun.
was filing back through your Twitter account this morning, just
Apologies.
seeing before the interview, just see what you had on there. I saw a manuscript, an image of a manuscript where you said there's a fingerprint
Yeah,
on it.
yeah. In Codex Sinaiticus, you can see a fingerprint. Probably the
Yeah,
scribe or somebody early on, because it's like the fingerprint is into the ink. Does that make sense? So
yeah, yeah,
you kind of have to think that happened when the ink was still drying. And that's just like, I mean, that's amazing,
yeah.
If that's actually the scribe's fingerprint, you've literally got his fingerprint. you know, you've got it metaphorically already in the text he copied, but now you've got it literally. So,
What are some other things that you and or your students have encountered as you've engaged these manuscripts?
well, I like to show them. I mean, one thing I like to do is just show 'em manuscripts where things are missing, so they can see the apparatus kind of come to life. The apparatus can often feel very stale, just a bunch of letters and symbols. But that's always fun. So, show them a manuscript with Codex Sinaiticus at Mark 1:1 and see the actual correction where the scribe seems to have corrected himself as he's copying and added the words "Son of God" in between the two lines. And so showing students things like that, they start to really see the humanity of the scribes behind them. I show manuscripts where, like, we have some manuscripts that have like canon lists in them, and there's some surprising things in those lists. So I think I'm thinking of Codex Claromontanus here for that. What else? I like to show them Codex Beza and some of the very funky things that happen in Codex Beza, which is a copy of the Gospels and Acts, both in Greek and Latin. Our first copy that has the woman caught in adultery in Greek. Stuff like that. I like to show them the things that don't make it into the apparatus. So most manuscripts, at least the Gospels, most manuscripts are going to have what's called the Eusebian apparatus, which is a set of cross-referencing system that Eusebius developed in the 4th century. He built on prior work, but he really develops it. And once he does, it appears in so many gospel manuscripts. And that means at the start of each of these manuscripts of the Gospels, you get these tables of comparisons. It's about 10 tables. Um, and so it's fun to explain those to students and how they work. You get lectionary markings to tell the person doing the scripture reading in Sunday where to start and stop the reading.
Mm.
You'll get marginal notes. There's a famous one in Codex Vaticanus at Hebrews 1 where there's been a triple correction. So scribe corrected it, then another scribe came along and said and changed it back. And there's a mark there that says basically, you idiot, don't change it, leave the old reading. And so, like, that's like a real person wrote that, and those are a lot of fun. Those are things that are a lot of fun to introduce students to, so they get a sense that these scribes were real people, these manuscripts were used by real people. They're not just abstractions that have been distilled into your apparatus, but they're real things. They're people's Bibles. That's what I like to say. They're real people's Bibles, and they use them.
Mm.
So
So your students tend to come away thinking, "Boy, this stuff is is way more interesting than I ever could have thought it would be,
That's the
than I
goal, yeah.
ever. Yeah, so I'm curious. Um, do they walk away? And you probably have to say yes to this, but do they tend to walk away thinking, all right, I trust Scripture more than I did before this class started?
Yeah, I think so. I think probably the way they would say it is something like, "My trust in Scripture is so much more well informed than it was before." Does that make
Mm,
sense? It's a slight,
yeah,
similar, but it's a slight difference.
yeah,
Because I think they came into the class trusting the Bible, and they hopefully leave trusting as well. But in between somewhere, and probably all the way through, they're going, "Wow, I have so many more reasons for that, and I'm so much more well informed." So like you kind of mentioned, the average Bible reader discovering for the first time that their Bible has footnotes can be just totally caught off guard by
yeah,
that. My students, by the end of the semester, they're like, "Oh yeah, of course there are." you know, it's like, so and it's like with anything, when you're learning something new, it can always be uh, not necessarily even troubling, but just sort of disorienting
yeah.
when you're learning something new. And by the time, and as you become more familiar, like you said you studied Mark's gospel. I'm sure there are things in Mark's gospel that used to really throw you, and now you're like, oh yeah, I understand that because I've studied Mark's gospel so much more, and now it's familiar to you, and it just so even just the sense of familiarity increases, and that kind of settles them down a bit. But it is fun because we get to have because I teach at a seminary and we have a high view of Scripture here. We do get to talk about theology. It's not just
Right.
let's look at manuscripts and talk about history. We do plenty of that, but we also are always integrating and thinking, okay, well, how do we think about our doctrine of Scripture in relation to this, what we're seeing here in Codex Beza?
Well, it's a good segue. I mean, how do we think about the doctrine of Scripture, and particularly, the question of inerrancy
Mhm.
seems never to, want to take a break. Like
Yeah,
it's always,
right.
at least in the United States, I
Yeah.
hear that it's not as big a deal outside the United States, which I'm a little skeptical of. That claim,
Yeah.
but you know. Yeah, what's your position on that? You mentioned you have a high view of Scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I hold to inerrancy myself. I think inerrancy is a doctrine that's important for the health of the church, and yeah, I think without it, you'll eventually get into pretty serious problems if you reject inerrancy. Now, I think it's important to say that inerrancy requires you to have a proper interpretation. Like, you can't know if something is an error or not until you understand the thing. So it's important to understand the biblical authors on their own terms as best we can. So things that otherwise might look like an error can turn out to not be an error once you
mm,
appreciate what they're doing.
right.
So I think the gospel writers, for example, can move things around for the sake of their narrative or give different details for the sake of the story they want to tell or the themes they want to emphasize, let's say. But yes, the question often has come up in relation to text criticism, and something I certainly wrestled with as a student myself. Partly because I think I was given an argument for inerrancy that I don't think is the best argument for it, and that was I was often given what I call the all or nothing argument, which is
Mm,
that if there's even one error in the Bible, you can't trust any of it.
right.
And that's it's a help, like when that that has a certain force to it because you think, well, yeah, that's a problem. It's kind of all or nothing, so I better not allow for any errors in the Bible.
Right.
My problem with that was never it was never historical or even theological per se. It was that I was interested in text criticism, and as far as I knew, every manuscript had errors in it.
Right.
Like we talked
Right.
about, right? Now, part of working through that was realizing, oh, I got to understand what error means here, okay? Because every manuscript does have scribal mistakes in it. That doesn't mean every manuscript necessarily has theological errors in it. And I think that helped me think through that. The other thing that helped me was I think there are two versions of the kind of all or nothing argument for inerrancy. One is if there's even one error in any copy of the Bible, you can't trust that copy of it. That form I think is bogus. I think that basically takes the Bible away from all of God's people in history. Like
Yeah.
it's
Right.
people use Codex Sinaiticus as their Bible, and it has scribal mistakes in it. I think they
Yeah.
were okay to use that Bible.
But
You
that
know,
that seems like honestly, that seems like the skeptics' perspective, the skeptics' agenda. If so they go hard after trying to prove one error or one thing wrong, thinking that like that whole house of cards will come
Mm-hmm.
crumbling down, right?
Right.
Pull
Yeah.
pull this one card out, or at
Yep.
least make it a little flimsy, and
Yeah.
the whole thing can't be trusted. And I
Yeah.
think honestly, man, I think a lot of believers like have that view.
Yes.
Like, I don't
Yeah.
know exactly how it gets baked into
Yeah.
everybody or like
Yeah.
into the church culture,
Yeah.
but that does seem to be the dominant
Yeah.
default perspective.
Yeah. Well, and it's partly this all or nothing argument, I think. And what I was going to add is that Augustine actually has a form of the all or nothing argument that I think is much better. He gets into a debate with Jerome at one point in the 4th century, and they're arguing about Peter's fallout with Paul that is described in Galatians. And Jerome seems to be of the opinion that Paul is not giving us the whole story because you could never actually have a real disagreement with the apostles on this level. And Augustine is basically like, no, you cannot allow any lies in the Bible at all. And he says the reason you can't is because the moment you allow that there's something wrong in the Bible, you become the arbiter of what's right and wrong, and you can't trust yourself to decide that. So it's not about like, well, if there's one error, you can't trust any of it. It's that if you are the decider, you actually are not trustworthy enough because of sin. Sin has influenced you in such a way that once you have decided that you can stand in a position of judgment over the Bible, there will be no end to what you decide you can reject.
Right.
To me, I think that is the form of the all or nothing argument that is right, and that's what I want to avoid. So I'm not willing to say that if a copy of the Bible has a mistake in it, therefore that copy can't be trusted. I think that's nonsense. I think most of us in church history have had Bibles that at points were not perfect, either through
Right.
translation mistakes or textual mistakes that have, were in there, whatever, but we still had perfectly good Bibles, right, that we
Right.
can use. But what I would say is once we get to a position where we're willing to say, I think this part of the Bible, this is the original text, and this is the right meaning, and it's wrong, that I think is where Augustine is right. You're in a world of trouble. Because now you've put yourself over and above the Bible, when what we want to do as Christians is always put ourselves under the Bible's authority. Do we have to do text criticism? Yes. Do we have to do interpretation and application? Yes. And are there points in each of those steps where we can make mistakes and come to the wrong conclusion? Yes. But in none of those should we be saying, I think this is the thing it says, but I'm going to reject it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When we go through those steps of textual criticism, interpretation, and then application, at each step along the way, we want to do it with an attitude that says the Bible is right and I'm wrong. If there's a difference between me and the Bible, I'm the problem, not it. And I think that's the right attitude we have to have when we approach the Bible.
This is a very different philosophical starting point.
I think so. Yeah.
Than someone like Ehrman would have, right? Where the idea is we start with suspicion, right? The scripture is
human book.
Is guilty. Well, it's
Purely
guilty.
Book. Yeah, it's guilty. Yeah.
You start with
Until
the presupposition that it's guilty, and then the burden of proof is put on you to prove that it's not.
Right.
Right.
And I think those of us that are Christians have, I've read the Bible my whole life. I've studied it now for, gosh, I don't know, ever since college. And, do I have questions about it? Of course. Do I have places where I'm like, I don't know what that means, or I don't know what to do with that? Of course I do. But I have learned over the years to trust the Bible. Like I have.
Yeah.
It has proven itself to me again and again. And I have enough things that I had like, man, I had a real question about that. And I do not know how to solve that problem. And then years later, I go, oh, more studies happen in between. I've listened to better sermons. I've read better commentary. Whatever it is, something clicked. And I go, that passage that before seemed like such a problem to me, now I see how life-giving it is, how good it is for me, whatever. And I've just learned that over the years to give the Bible the benefit of the doubt every time.
I love
that. It is so much more trustworthy than I am. So what am I going to put my trust in? Am I going to put my trust ultimately in a scholar like Bart Ehrman or in the Bible itself as I understand it? The Bible has proven itself to me again and again. So there are still places where I don't have answers to questions I have or to problems I see. And I live with that because it's proven to me in so many places. Besides that, it's not a problem for me.
Well, let me ask you one more question. Because, I see this a lot surprisingly a lot still. The KJV only folks,
Yeah.
and I'm curious about their response to what you're doing, or what sort of interaction have you had with those folks?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, personally, I don't have any. I should just say this because some people who do what I do have a background in King James only. I don't. I didn't grow up King James only, so my knowledge of King James onlyism is always secondhand, in the sense that it's people who are asking me about it, or people who hold that view and don't like what I do, maybe. But I can't. It's not the kind of thing I can say I once believed it and now I've rejected it. Do you know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like it's never been a thing for me. So. But yes, I do have people who are King James only who tend to not like what I do. And I've had some debates. People can search on YouTube. I've done a couple debates. Now, I should say King James onlyism as a term can describe a number of different people. And one of the things that you find is that what tends to unify King James onlyists is that they all agree they do not like modern translations. But when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of why they prefer the King James, there are different ways they get to that conclusion. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so some of them would be adamant that they are not like those other King James onlyists, and some would be adamant that they're not King James onlyists at all, even
Right.
though they end up in the same place of highly valuing the King James, highly disliking any modern translation. You know what I mean? And to
Right.
us outsiders, they look like all the same. But there are some fine distinctions when you get into the nitty gritty that matter a lot to them. So, but yes, I've had some interaction with them. What do you want to know about them?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Like, I would imagine that they would be pretty upset by
Yeah,
what you've
sure.
got going on.
I
Yeah.
think what they object to is they're concerned that what I do leads to too much uncertainty. And that it kind of does what I described earlier we shouldn't do. It puts a human being in the place of judgment where I'm the
Yeah.
one who's saying, well, what does Mark 1:1 say? And they don't like that. I think it's fair to say they want God to be in that position of deciding what Mark 1:1 says, right? Which at some level, so do I. But the problem
Right.
is that God in his sovereignty has decided that there will be multiple manuscripts of the Bible, that scribes were not preserved from making errors. And so theologically, I think the big difference is this. King James onlyists and those in that general stream, okay, tend to think that God must have protected the scribes from error in such a way that we don't have to worry about textual criticism. We don't have to do it.
Mm.
And I just don't find anywhere in Scripture that promises that. So I don't believe that that's what God, I don't think it's what he did when I look at the evidence, and I don't think it's what he promised to do. So, for example, when Jesus says, not a jot or a tittle of the law will pass away until all is fulfilled in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think he's talking about scribal copying of the Gospels. I think he's talking about the Old Testament's authority, and that not even the smallest amount of the Old Testament's authority is going to go away with his coming, right? Instead, what's going to happen is it's actually going to be fulfilled, which is an important difference. So even though he uses if I can put it this way, the analogy of a jot and a tittle, that's a writing analogy, a writing illustration, he's not talking about God protecting every scribe from making mistakes. He's talking about the fact that the Old Testament's authority is not fudged in the least with his coming. So there are passages like that where I simply have a different interpretation of what the Bible is saying than they do, and they tend to read it as this is proof that God promises that the Bible will be preserved all the time down to the letter. And I just think that's not what those passages mean, and that's not what God actually did. So
Right.
I like to think of it, what I do as a text critic is similar to what grammarians do, right? There's no inspired Greek grammar book that tells us what the aorist participle means, is there? So
Mm.
how do we figure it out? We study Greek, and we try to read as much Greek as we can, and we inductively try to determine what is the significance of the aorist participle, say, versus the present participle. I think it's similar with text criticism. God expects us to use our reason that he's given us, our brains, to try to identify what the original text is as best we can and follow that. And he's just okay with there being some level of uncertainty. And I don't think it's a level of uncertainty that in any way undercuts the ultimate authority of the Bible. That's just my view.
Yeah, it leaves some space for what we might call faith.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
so, well, Peter, man, it's been It's been good to meet you and good to chat with
Yeah,
you, man. Thanks for carving out some time to talk.
you're very
This has
welcome.
been great. Yeah. Great start to my morning here in Hawaii. So, um,
Sorry to have woken you up.
no,
You had to get
no.
up. But
No, this is great. We already we mentioned textandcanon.org.
yeah,
And I know you. If someone Googles you, Peter J. Gurry, they're going to find your faculty
sure.
page at Phoenix Seminary. Do you have a personal website, like, or no?
It's funny. I used to do web design, so if people go to gurrydesign.com, they'll find my old web designs, but they're probably not interested in that. If you go to one other place I write though is somewhat regularly is there's a blog called the Evangelical Textual Criticism
Right.
blog. I won't give you the URL because it's too long, but just Google it and you'll find it. I am not the only person who writes for that, but there's a group of us who are all evangelical. We're all text critics, and that's kind of like in the weeds. So the stuff at Text and Canon tends to be more accessible, written for the layperson. The stuff at the Evangelical Text Criticism blog tends to be well, it just assumes that you know more.
Right.
But
Right.
for those that are maybe students and are studying this in school, they may find some stuff at the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog that pushes them even further. So
Yeah.
yeah,
All right.
they can check
I
that out.
mentioned earlier that you're on Twitter, so people, or X now, so
Yeah,
people can follow
you can find me
you
there.
on there.
Yep,
Any other place where people can keep up with what you're doing?
I think that's probably it. That's probably the
Yeah.
big ones. Yeah,
Well, friends, yeah, head over to textandcanon.org, check that out, and pick up a couple of those books. And there's a bunch of articles over there that you can see too. And there'll be announcements about upcoming conferences, and there's videos and stuff on there as well. You guys just released some videos from the
yeah,
conference, right?
yeah. That's right. So we have, the book is called Scribes and Scripture. It's about how we got the Bible. We do these church conferences on the same topic, and then what we did last year is we recorded those talks with the professional film crew. And so we now sell those. So if people can't make it to a conference, like we're not speaking in your city, but you really want to watch the videos, that's a great way to get that content. It's very engaging. We've got lots of slideshows and pictures and stuff. So it's not just me talking behind my
Mm,
desk. It's pretty engaging. So yeah, people can check that out. Just go to texandcanada.org. It's right there on the homepage. Look for Scribes and Scripture video, and they'll find more.
excellent. Yeah, do that. And after you've done that, go follow Dr. Gurry on X. And once you've done that, head over to glossahouse.com. We've got some great resources over there. Always, always new stuff coming down the pipeline. So we're excited about that. At the time of recording this, Dr. Robert Homestead has just released his early Ethiopic grammar. So it's awesome. It's incredible. It's a beautiful book. He's done a great job on that. So working with Giz and throwback to the Coptic church there. But yeah, lots of really good stuff. And head over to the Proof Text podcast and Glossa House TV, all kinds of stuff. And you could spend hours and days looking into all this stuff. But lots of resources and lots of it free too. Some of it paid, but all good stuff. So, Dr. Gurry, man, thanks so much for doing this, and thanks to everybody for watching and listening. We're gonna wrap it up there and say we hope that helped.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.